Hello, I am Riley Wilson, and welcome to the Band of One podcast. This podcast is created to help anyone that wants to be a more successful solo performer or become a solo performer and avoid a lot of the pratfalls and mistakes myself and some of my contemporaries have made. I have over 50 years of live performance experience and will also include tips from other top pros worldwide who've done the same thing in their regions. My desire is to make this actionable as well as entertaining. If you like what we do, subscribe and don't forget to share it. Let's get busy. Let's talk about equipment necessary for a successful solo show. During my writing career with magazines like Vintage Guitar, Guitar World, Guitar School, and Gig, I reviewed a lot of pieces of equipment and came up with things that I feel are important, especially for a successful working musician. Now, if you are a solo piano player and only work restaurants with their own pianos, much of this information might not be applicable. However, even working piano players often have their own portable keyboards that they can use for events away from their typical gig. I'm sure much of this information will be helpful, and I will certainly suggest things not to do, as I've accumulated a lot of unnecessary gear over the decades. Many of you who have been playing in groups have a lot of gear you need already. You guitar players or horn players already have a favorite instrument that's worked well for you and it is proven in combat. If you sing, you probably already have a vocal mic and mic stand that works just fine. If you already use amplification, then you may very well have something that works just fine for a solo show. However, those of you using Marshall stacks are probably going to have to change your amplification approach. Most solo performers prefer a clean and clear amplification setup in order to be heard clearly and distinctly. This is especially important playing retirement facilities. As a solo performer, you will need to be able to communicate to your audience, often over a microphone, which means speaking slower and cleaner. I suggest watching other solo performers to get an idea of what works for them. If you ask a solo performer on a break why they use the gear that they do, they will usually be able to be quite articulate about what works for them and why they prefer it. I make it a point of asking people about their gear on a break just to get their input on what seems to work well and why. Since solo performing is a solitary affair, you'll find many performers happy to divulge what they use and why they prefer it. For example, my family and I were vacationing in Panama Beach, Florida last summer, and I heard a good acoustic guitar player. He mentioned that he is using essentially a plywood Taylor guitar because his nice solid wood guitars would simply melt and fall apart in the intense humidity and heat. I've used all kinds of acoustic guitars over the years and keep returning to Ovation guitars. They're incredibly sturdy, stay in tune well, and are comfortable to play whether I'm playing indoors or out. Now, here in Texas, I could be playing a cold weather gig with temperatures in the 40s outdoors during the winter or over 100 degrees in the summertime, and I need something that shows up for work every time and works without fail. Once you develop a successful show and can justify spending the money, you may want to have more than one amplification system. Most of my smaller shows, I'm using a Fishman Artist solo amplifier. It weighs less than 30 pounds and has excellent coverage for audiences of less than 100 people. I can play my electric or acoustic guitars, run my tracks via Bluetooth from my phone or iPad, and sing through the same amplifier with excellent results. It has onboard reverb for my voice, an acoustic guitar, and an XLR output jack I can use either to record my show or output the amp to a large house system for big corporate gigs. If at all possible, I prefer to bring this smaller rig just because I've developed back problems after more than 50 years of live shows. I also have a larger rig, and I've gone through many such setups over the last 15 to 20 years. I used to use a separate mixer with a pair of JBL Eons as well as some Yamaha NS400s, which also worked for my duo and trio at the same time. Now, this was nice if I wanted to run a show in stereo. However, it got weighty, and I decided to get rid of it in favor of a Bose system, which we ran for solo, duo, and trio gigs for a while. About 6 years ago, the duo and trio really stopped being functional, and I was concentrating on getting a good sound system that I could carry back and forth myself with just a hand truck. I used the TurboSound IP2000 after that Bose L1 system too, and then about 2 years ago switched to an EV Evolve 30 system which works beautifully. The IP2000 required a small external mixer, and the subwoofer weighed 54 pounds. The unit sounded great, even outdoors, but the subwoofer became more and more difficult to carry. With the EV system, the subwoofer itself only weighs 36 pounds and provides about 90% of the same coverage and volume as the larger TurboSound unit. I've mentioned names on this podcast for a couple of reasons. For those of you that are coming from a band format, you may recognize some of these types of sound systems. I also emphasize the importance of getting something that provides excellent cost-to-weight ratio of the system. Many of your shows will be you and you only, carrying in the gear, setting up the gear, playing the show, knocking down the gear, and then driving home. If the gig goes into extra innings, you're going to be more tired than you might normally be after just a 2 or 3 hour performance. In my old band, the Fabulous Shades, we used to have a saying, "Every step you save is a step you save." Well, with the solo show, every pound you don't have to carry is 2 pounds you don't have to carry. So here's a question: how much is too much? A friend of mine and I started a trio in the late 80s, and he got a deal on a couple huge PVPA speaker cabinets. While we could lug the gear to and from the gig in a truck, the first show we did was up a flight of steps, and those cabinets, which looked like a 412 guitar cabinet on steroids, ended up being way too much to carry. He sold those ginormous PA speakers and ended up with a carbon system that sounded great and weighed a lot less. Now, you might luck out and play regularly at a venue that provides a house system. This can be both good and bad. Good in that you don't have to carry and set up a system. Bad, since you may or may not like the sound coming out of the system. You could also do what Yancey Stevens suggested back in his podcast interview. Insist that the client provide a sound system for you. Yancey was pretty well established by this point in his career, and he could pretty much ask whatever he needed and a client was going to agree to it. Early on in your solo career, I think it's much better to be self-sufficient. Another popular type of sound system is the battery-operated PA system. I owned a Roland BA330 several years ago, which worked pretty well strictly on batteries. It also included an AC adapter and worked well for smaller crowds up to 50 or 60 people. Other companies also make this type of sound system, and if you find yourself regularly playing events without power, like on a beach or a mountain gig or whatever, having a battery-operated system just gives you that much more leverage to book and play more jobs. Unless you only play acoustic and don't bring anything else, you'll benefit from having some sort of dolly or hand truck. I have a folding device my wife got for me from Northern Hydraulic a couple years ago that works great on almost all my shows. I can use it either vertically or horizontally, and I can get all my gear on this in one trip. My only criticism is I wish that the wheels were a little bit larger to go over more difficult terrain. It's reasonably lightweight and folds up, which makes not just carrying but storing it at shows much more convenient. Unless you're going with strictly acoustic instruments, you're probably going to have some accessories to carry. I like the molded plastic trunks you can get from a hardware store or a typical big box store. They are cheap and do a good job of carrying cables, stands, effects processors, mics, and the like. I worked with a group that did strictly hotel lounges in the early 80s, and we learned the importance of having a tidy stage. This band consumed a lot of duct tape. Aesthetically, it's important to look like a professional no matter where you perform. People buy with their eyes. You're auditioning for the next gig while you're playing the one you're set up to do today. We'll talk about actual gig protocols in a separate podcast, but I do think it's important to be able to set up and have a good-looking staging area, even if it's just you, a guitar or your horn, and a small amplifier. I think it's important that you get some shows under your belt and use whatever gear you have at that time in order to play the show. You do not need to go out and spend a lot of money in order to start making money as a solo performer. Look at your equipment honestly and ask if it will do the job you needed it to do. I mentioned the different types of equipment that I've had over the last 20-plus years as a solo performer, but when I started out in 1994, I had traded a guitar to one of my former students for a small little PVPA system, It had 2 cabinets with 2 10-inch speakers in each cabinet. I was playing guitar, singing, and using MIDI tracks with a MIDI playback device, and it worked just fine. If you do end up getting busy enough to perform every weekend or do multiple shows in a week like I sometimes do, then you can look at spending a little bit more to get a little more in return. One of the great things about being in a solo act is that aside from a sound system, you don't necessarily need to spend a fortune in order to get great results. Now, I mentioned on a previous podcast I record most of my shows on a Zoom H1 digital recorder and can then go back and listen after the event has already passed and tell what sounds good and what songs need work. This is helpful particularly if I start playing mental tricks on myself and believe that I sound worse than I really do. As I've also mentioned before, my wife often accompanies me on shows and can provide an objective viewpoint by being out in the audience and visually seeing what works and what doesn't. Many performers end up playing these mental tricks on themselves and end up convincing them that they have to spend $3,000 or more on a guitar and $5,000 on an amplifier in order to improve. The truth is, they're probably not going to sound much better with the expensive gear. If the gear you have simply doesn't work for your show, then by all means look at getting it. I am a huge fan of used gear. Now, while there's no market for used guitar strings or broken drumsticks that I can tell, I can find a guitar, an amplifier, or a PA system used and save that money for something more important for me and my family. I've trolled Craigslist for years and now love Facebook Marketplace here in the United States. I also sometimes find gems on sites like Nextdoor, 5 Mile, etc., and I'm sure in the future other similar marketplaces will exist. I have also purchased occasionally from eBay and Reverb, although I prefer to find things locally to take shipping and now taxes out of the equation. I used to do the same thing with Harmony Central. My duo and trio partner Brian Stroud found a used Alesis QR7 keyboard on Harmony Central a week before we did our first show together. This was back in 2000, and it still sounds and plays fine. This keyboard was the basis of our duo and trio for both bass and keyboard sounds for more than 15 years. Could Brian have bought a fancier or newer keyboard? Sure, but it wouldn't have made any difference in how much money we made. It did the job, and it's important to keep that in perspective. I know some of you musicians may be concerned about buying used gear out of warranty. Most gear made these days is pretty reliable, and if you have a chance to check out the piece of equipment in person before you actually use it, you can get a good idea of what kind of condition it's in. For example, if you're buying a guitar or bass, check out the frets. Are they worn and chewed up? If they are, then you're probably going to have to factor a fret job in with the cost of the instrument. With an amplifier, make sure that the speakers work, and crank it up at least briefly to be sure that there's no rattles or hums or issues with speakers flapping, etc. You can also ask the seller why they're getting rid of it. Watching online reviews on YouTube or reading about them on the internet is also helpful to steer you in the right direction. Some items simply have to be bought brand new, like guitar strings, software, etc. When buying new, check out your local store as well as online resources like Musician's Friend, Sweetwater, Sam Ash, etc. If you're lucky enough to have a good music store in town, it's often worth a few bucks more on your purchases to develop a relationship with a business so you can smoke test gear before dropping the big bucks on it. I taught guitar in independent music stores for years and believe they are really important for our nation's success economically. Now, with all this talk about equipment, there are really some types of equipment that have made a big difference in a show. The keyboard industry changed fundamentally in the early 1980s with the advent of the Yamaha DX7 keyboard. Prior to this, keyboard players hauled Hammond organs, Leslie tone cabinets, electric pianos and amplifiers, synthesizers, and the like, all of which helped make my back problem probably worse than it already was. With the advent of digital technology, you can get all these sounds out of just one piece of gear. Because of this technology, Brian could get all these great sounds out of just one keyboard that weighed less than 40 pounds. This was a tremendous boon to our duo and trio. He played both bass and keyboard parts, and with our duo gigs, kicked an Alesis drum machine on and off. You can hear how effective this was on our Think Twice Live video on YouTube with the aforementioned JBL Eon system. For guitar players, Modeling amps or multi-effects processors let you bring a recording studio's worth of gear to every show without breaking the bank or your spine. I've been using modeling processors for my electric guitar tones for more than 2 decades, and it's always worked well for me. If you choose a guitar that's versatile, you can get multiple sounds out of the guitar and amp without having to bring multiple instruments. Remember, as a solo performer, you want to travel light and work effectively. I personally have never drug a laptop computer on shows to play backing tracks. I realize I'm in the minority, but the thought of taking a computer with a hard drive to a show and risking it failing because of heat, direct sunlight, people spilling drinks on it, etc., made me rethink the entire process. Instead, I used an iPod Touch to play my backing tracks, and it worked incredibly well and very cost-effective. Now I use my iPhone as well as my iPad Pro. In this way, if a battery were to fail on one device, I have the other one at the gig and don't have to worry about losing the tracks I've worked so hard on. Now, gear is only one part of the equation. You have to have talent and skills, and you need to know how to use them when performing in front of other people. Get your solo show up and running and clicking on all 8 cylinders. Then, if you really need to make a change with your gear, look for something used or splurge on something new if you feel impressed and have the budget. When in doubt, write down a pros and cons list and use that to help you determine when to make a new gear purchase. Okay, let's do something. Actionable item. Make a list of all the gear you currently own. You can do this on your computer if you like, or your phone. It's a good idea also to put a dollar value next to it, either what you spent on it or what's the value it's worth if you chose to sell it used. Now, this is wonderful information in case you need to get insurance to travel with your gear. Okay, that's enough gear talk for one podcast. I look forward to hearing back from you about this topic and reserve the right to do an equipment podcast follow-up in the future. You've been listening to the Band of One podcast. I'm Riley Wilson, and thanks for joining us. If you have ideas for upcoming episodes, I'd love to hear from you. Get in touch with us at your convenience through our Facebook page, The Band of One Podcast. You can also contact me directly at my website, which is www.guitarmadesimpler.com. See you next time.